The hardest battle of my life wasn't during military training. It was proving to myself that I belonged there. My name is Sienna Brooks. If someone had told the 16-year-old version of me that one day I would wear the United States Army uniform, I probably would have laughed. Not because I didn't dream about it, because I honestly didn't think I was capable. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky where most people knew each other. My father worked as a mechanic, my mother was a nurse, and neither of them had served in the military. Joining the Army wasn't a family tradition. It was simply an idea that came into my mind during my senior year of high school. The idea stayed with me because I wanted to do something that challenged me. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what I could have become if I had tried. When I told my parents, they didn't discourage me. My dad just looked at me for a few seconds before saying, "If you're going to do this, don't do it to impress anyone. Do it because you're willing to earn it." That sentence stayed with me. A few months later, I walked into an Army recruiting office for the first time. I was nervous enough that my hands were shaking. The recruiter didn't try to convince me to enlist. Instead, he asked me a simple question. "Why do you want to join?" I paused for a moment, because I realized I didn't have the perfect answer. Finally, I said, "I want to become someone who can handle difficult things." He smiled. "That's the most honest answer I've heard all week." Before I could sign anything, I had to pass the physical requirements. That was the part that scared me. I wasn't overweight. I wasn't unhealthy. But I had never considered myself athletic. Even the way people spoke. Within the first hour, I realized that military life wasn't about looking confident. It was about listening carefully, learning quickly, and working as a team. The first week was overwhelming. We woke up before sunrise every morning. There was physical training, classroom instruction, equipment checks, and endless marching. By the end of each day, I was completely exhausted. One evening, after finishing a long training exercise, I sat on my bunk and looked at my boots. My feet were covered with blisters. My shoulders were sore from carrying my rucksack. I remember thinking, what if I'm simply not strong enough for this? The recruit in the bunk across from me noticed I was unusually quiet. Her name was Ava Martinez. She smiled and asked, "First week hitting you hard?" I laughed. "A little more than I expected." She nodded. The days were still exhausting, but they no longer felt impossible. I knew where to be. I knew what was expected. And I had stopped counting how many weeks were left. One morning, our drill sergeant announced that we would complete our first 12-mile ruck march in a few days. For anyone outside the military, it probably doesn't sound like much. But carrying a heavy rucksack for 12 miles while staying with your unit is physically and mentally demanding. The moment I heard the distance, I felt nervous. I had trained before enlisting, but I had never carried that much weight for that long. For the next few days, everyone talked about the march. Some recruits were excited. Others tried to hide how worried they were. The night before the march, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of failing. I was afraid of slowing everyone else down. Before sunrise, we lined up with our gear. The air was cold, and nobody spoke very much. As soon as we started walking, I focused on one thing. Don't think about 12 miles. Just reach the next mile marker. The first few miles went well. Then my shoulders began to ache. Around the 7th mile, I felt my energy dropping. Every step became harder than the one before. I kept looking at the ground instead of the road ahead. At one point, I quietly told myself, I don't think I can do this. The recruit walking beside me heard me. Without saying anything dramatic, she simply smiled and said, then don't think about finishing. Just keep taking the next step. It sounds simple, but that's exactly what I did. One step, then another, then another. Hours later, we crossed the finish line together. Nobody celebrated. Nobody acted like superheroes. We were just tired, completely exhausted. But we had all finished. But training didn't adjust to how we felt. It continued no matter what. One of the biggest challenges during that phase was learning how to function when you were running on very little rest. We had classroom sessions during the day, physical training in the afternoon, and equipment maintenance in the evening. By the time we returned to the barracks, most of us barely had energy to talk. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat down on my bunk and just stared at my gear. Nothing had gone wrong that day, but I felt mentally drained. That was something nobody really prepares you for in training. Not the physical exhaustion, but the mental pressure of constantly being alert, constantly being corrected, and constantly trying not to make mistakes. The recruit across from me, Ava, noticed I was unusually quiet again. She didn't ask if I was okay. She already knew the answer would be something like, I'm fine. Instead, she simply said, you're thinking too much again. I laughed slightly. Probably. She tied her boots while talking. The days feel long now, but they're all the same. You just have to get through one at a time. At that moment, I realized something important about military training. It wasn't about surviving a single hard day. It was about handling a long series of difficult days without breaking down. The next morning, during physical training, I pushed myself a little more than I had the day before. Not because anyone was watching, but because I had started to understand the rhythm of training. Some days you improve. Some days you maintain. But you never go backward. Slowly, I stopped seeing myself as someone trying to survive training. I started seeing myself as someone who was learning how to adapt to it. Confidence doesn't come from one good day. It comes from doing it enough times that it stops feeling unfamiliar. That made sense. Over the next few days, I noticed small improvements I would have ignored before. My movements were smoother. My reactions were quicker. I made fewer mistakes during drills. Nothing dramatic had changed overnight, but I could feel progress building quietly in the background. And for the first time since training began, I stopped waiting to feel ready. Instead, I focused on becoming reliable. Because in the military, reliability matters more than emotion. And slowly, I started to understand that I wasn't just being trained to pass tests. I was being trained to stay calm when things didn't go as expected. By the 7th week, something had changed inside the platoon. We still got tired. We still made mistakes. But panic had started to disappear. Even when things went wrong, people didn't freeze the way they used to in the beginning. We were learning how to correct ourselves quickly and move on. That was new for all of us. One morning, during a field training exercise, we were given a scenario that required teamwork under time pressure. It wasn't about individual performance. It was about coordination. Each person had a role, and if one person failed to complete it properly, the whole team would struggle. I was assigned a support position, which meant I had to stay aware of the group's movement and assist wherever needed. At first, I thought my role was less important, But I quickly realized there were no small roles in training. Everything mattered. Halfway through the exercise, one of the recruits made a small error in positioning. It wasn't serious, but it disrupted the timing of the group. For a few seconds, things felt off. Instead of panicking, the team adjusted. Someone called out instructions calmly. Another recruit corrected their position. We recovered within moments. After the exercise, while we were resting, the instructor gave feedback. He didn't focus on perfection. He focused on response. You didn't avoid mistakes, he said. You corrected them without losing control. That's progress. That stayed with me, because earlier in training, even small mistakes felt overwhelming. Now they felt manageable. Later that day, Ava and I talked while organizing our gear. She said something simple but important. We're not trying to be perfect soldiers yet. We're just learning how to stay steady when things aren't perfect. It sounded obvious, but it wasn't something I had understood until then. Training wasn't building perfection. It was building consistency under pressure. That evening, I noticed something about myself. I wasn't as anxious as I used to be. Not because training had become easier, but because I had stopped expecting it to be easy in the first place. And that changed everything about how I approached each new day. By the 8th week, training started to feel less chaotic and more structured. We still had early mornings, long drills, and constant evaluation, but now we understood the system behind it. Instead of reacting to everything, we were learning how to anticipate what was expected. One of the biggest changes I noticed was in how we worked as a group. In the beginning, everyone focused on themselves. Now we naturally started checking on each other. If someone forgot equipment, another recruit would quietly help. If someone was struggling during a run, the group would adjust pace without being told. It wasn't discussed. It just became normal. That morning, we had a long conditioning test. It included running, push-ups, and several timed exercises. Nothing new, but the intensity made it challenging. Halfway through, I felt my energy drop again. Not exhaustion like the first weeks, but that familiar mental resistance that shows up when your body wants to slow down. Instead of stopping, I focused on maintaining rhythm, breathing, step, movement. One of the instructors noticed but didn't say anything in the moment. After we finished, he gathered us and gave feedback. You're not the same recruits you were a month ago, he said. That's visible in how you recover, not just how you perform. That line stayed with me, because I realized improvement isn't always about speed or strength. Sometimes it's about how quickly you recover after difficulty. Later that day, Ava and I sat outside the barracks during a short break. She looked tired but calm. I think I finally stopped doubting myself every minute, she said. I nodded. Me too. And I realized she was right. The constant noise in my head, the fear of failing, of not being enough, had slowly quieted. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled my decisions. For the first time since training began, I wasn't thinking about surviving the process. I was thinking about completing it. And that difference was everything. By the 9th week, graduation no longer felt like a distant goal. For the first time, we could actually see the finish line. That didn't make training easier. If anything, the expectations became higher. The instructors paid closer attention to every detail. Uniforms had to be perfect. Equipment had to be organized. Small mistakes that might have been overlooked during the first weeks were now corrected immediately. One morning, we had a full evaluation that combined everything we had learned over the previous 2 months. Physical fitness, teamwork, field exercises, decision-making. It wasn't about doing one thing well. It was about staying consistent from beginning to end. I remember feeling nervous before it started. Not because I doubted my ability, but because I didn't want months of hard work to be wasted by one careless mistake. As the day went on, I realized something. The things that had once felt impossible had become routine. Carrying heavy equipment no longer shocked my body. Following instructions under pressure felt natural. Even when I made a mistake, I corrected it without letting it affect the rest of my performance. I truly believed it. The final week of basic combat training arrived much faster than I expected. For weeks, graduation had felt so far away that I stopped thinking about it. Now suddenly, we were preparing for the last evaluations. Looking around the barracks, I realized how much everyone had changed. The nervous faces I had met on the first day were gone. In their place were confident recruits who had learned to trust themselves and each other. One afternoon, while packing some of my gear, I found the notebook I had brought from home. On the very first page, I had written one sentence before leaving. "I hope I'm strong enough." I smiled when I read it. Not because I had become the strongest person in my platoon. I hadn't. But because I had learned that strength isn't measured by how much weight you can carry, or how fast you can run. Real strength is showing up every day, even when you're unsure of yourself. Graduation morning was surprisingly quiet. We spent hours preparing our uniforms, making sure every detail was exactly as it should be. When we finally walked onto the parade field, I spotted my parents sitting in the audience. My mom was already crying before the ceremony had even started. My dad just smiled. It was the same calm smile he had given me at the airport months earlier. After the ceremony, he walked toward me. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at the army patch on my shoulder and smiled. "You earned it." Those were the only 3 words he said. But they meant more to me than any speech ever could. Later that evening, as I packed my bags for the next stage of my Army career, I thought about the girl who couldn't finish a 2-mile run. The girl who doubted herself. The girl who almost quit before she had even begun. She wasn't gone. She had simply grown into someone who understood that confidence doesn't come first. It comes after choosing not to give up. Graduating from basic combat training wasn't the biggest achievement of my life. It was the foundation for everything that came next. And for the first time, when someone asked me who I was, I could answer without hesitation. My name is Sienna Brooks, and I'm a United States Army soldier. After graduation, I was assigned to my first duty station. I had imagined that finishing basic combat training would make me feel completely confident. It didn't. Starting over in a new unit brought a different kind of challenge. Everyone around me already knew their jobs. They understood the routines, the expectations, and the culture of the unit. I was the new soldier trying to find my place. During my first few weeks, I spent more time listening than talking. Whenever I didn't know something, I asked questions. At first, I worried that people would think asking questions made me look inexperienced. Then one of the sergeants told me something I've never forgotten. The soldier who asks today won't make the same mistake tomorrow. From that day on, I stopped pretending to know everything. I focused on learning. One afternoon, our squad was preparing vehicles before a field exercise. Everyone had a task. Mine seemed simple compared to everyone else's. For a moment I caught myself thinking, I wish I had a more important job. The staff sergeant noticed my expression. He walked over and said, "There's no such thing as a small job here. If one person ignores their responsibility, everyone feels the consequences." That changed the way I looked at military life. I had imagined that finishing basic combat training would make me feel completely confident. It didn't. Starting over in a new unit brought a different kind of challenge. Everyone around me already knew their jobs. They understood the routines, the expectations, and the culture of the unit. I was the new soldier trying to find my place. During my first few weeks, I spent more time listening than talking. Whenever I didn't know something, I asked questions. At first, I worried that people would think asking questions made me look inexperienced. Then one of the sergeants told me something I've never forgotten. The soldier who asks today won't make the same mistake tomorrow. From that day on, I stopped pretending to know everything. I focused on learning. One afternoon, our squad was preparing vehicles before a field exercise. Everyone had a task. Mine seemed simple compared to everyone else's. For a moment I caught myself thinking, I wish I had a more important job. The staff sergeant noticed my expression. He walked over and said, "There's no such thing as a small job here. If one person ignores their responsibility, everyone feels the consequences." That changed the way I looked at military life. It wasn't about standing out. It was about being dependable. Over the next few months, I became more comfortable in the unit. The people who had once been strangers slowly became teammates I trusted. We trained together, solved problems together, learned from each other's mistakes. For the first time since joining the Army, I stopped feeling like I had something to prove. I realized I wasn't there to compete with anyone. I was there to become someone my team could rely on. Looking back now, I think that's when I truly became a soldier. Not the day I graduated, not the day I put on the uniform, but the day I understood that serving isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about doing your job well enough that the people beside you know they can count on you. About a year after arriving at my first duty station, something happened that completely changed the way I looked at leadership. Until then, I believed good leaders were the ones who always had the right answers. I was wrong. During a field training exercise, our team was working through a long day of missions. Everyone was tired, the weather was getting worse, and nothing seemed to be going according to plan. At one point, I made a mistake while relaying information to another team. It wasn't a dangerous mistake, but it slowed things down and created extra work for everyone. And now it was my turn to do the same for someone else. By my third year in the Army, I finally stopped feeling like the newest person in the room. The soldiers who had arrived after me now came to me with questions. Sometimes it was about equipment. Sometimes it was about training. And sometimes they just needed someone to tell them that what they were feeling was normal. One afternoon, a young private sat beside me after a long day in the field. He looked frustrated. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," he said. I smiled because I remembered saying almost the exact same thing to myself during basic combat training. Instead of giving him a motivational speech, I asked him a simple question. "Did you do your best today?" He nodded. "Then come back tomorrow and do your best again. That's all anyone expects." He looked relieved. It reminded me how powerful honest conversations can be. Around that time, I was selected to attend a leadership development course. It wasn't because I was the fastest runner or the best shooter. It was because my chain of command believed I was dependable. That meant more to me than any award. During the course, one instructor said something I've carried with me ever since. People don't remember every order you give. They remember how you treated them. Those words stayed with me. From then on, whenever I worked with younger soldiers, I tried to be patient. I corrected mistakes. I expected high standards. But I also remembered what it felt like to be new and unsure of myself. Looking back, I realized my biggest achievement wasn't earning a uniform or completing difficult training. It was becoming someone another soldier could trust. Because in the Army, skills can be taught. Experience comes with time. But earning someone's trust. For a while, neither of us said much. Then he looked at me and smiled. "You've changed." I laughed. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is. You're calmer. You listen more. And you don't doubt yourself the way you used to." I hadn't noticed those changes myself. Maybe because they had happened so slowly. Later that night, I opened an old box in my childhood bedroom. Inside were school certificates, family photos, and a notebook I had written in when I was 17. One page caught my attention. I had written down a list of things I hoped I would become one day. Confident, disciplined, independent, someone people could rely on. I smiled because I realized something. The Army hadn't changed who I was. It had helped me become the person I had always wanted to be. The next morning, before driving back to my unit, my dad walked me to my car. As I loaded my bag into the trunk, he stopped me. "I've never told you this before." I looked at him. "When you said you wanted to join the Army, I was worried. I didn't know if you'd make it." He paused for a moment before continuing. "I've never been happier to be wrong." Those words meant more to me than any certificate or recognition I had ever received. As I drove back to base, I realized success isn't always measured by rank, medals, or promotions. Sometimes, success is hearing the people who love you say, "We're proud of the person you've become." And for me, that was enough. When people hear that I served in the Army, they usually ask about the toughest day of my career. They expect me to talk about a difficult training exercise or a long deployment. But that's not the answer I give. The toughest day was the one when I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. After several years of service, I had earned the respect of my unit. I had completed every course that was required of me. I had worked with soldiers who became lifelong friends. I had learned lessons that no classroom could ever teach. One afternoon, I was asked to speak to a group of new recruits who had just arrived at the installation. Standing in front of them felt strange. Not long ago, I had been sitting exactly where they were. Nervous, unsure, wondering if I truly belonged. I looked around the room and smiled. "I know some of you are scared." A few people laughed quietly. I was too, and that's okay. I told them about my first run, when I couldn't even finish without stopping. I told them about the nights I questioned myself. I told them that confidence didn't appear overnight. It was built one ordinary day at a time. When I finished speaking, a young recruit walked over to me. She said, "I've been thinking about quitting before training even starts." I asked her why. She looked down and quietly replied, "I don't think I'm good enough." I smiled because I had once said those exact words to myself. I told her the same thing my father told me years earlier. You don't have to prove you're the best. You just have to keep showing up. A few months later, I received a handwritten letter from that same recruit. She had completed her training. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote one sentence I'll never forget. Thank you for reminding me that believing in myself was part of the training too. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook I had carried since the beginning of my journey. Sometimes I open it and read that letter again, not to remember what I accomplished, but to remember why I joined in the first place. The Army gave me discipline. It gave me lifelong friendships. It taught me responsibility. But the greatest lesson it ever taught me was this. Real strength isn't about being fearless. It's about taking the next step, even when you're afraid. If you're watching this and you're doubting yourself the way I once did, I hope my story reminds you of one thing. Your starting point doesn't decide your future. The decision to keep moving forward does. My name is Sienna Brooks. This was my journey. And if I had the chance to live it all over again, I would choose the same path every single time.